Counting on it.
In the heyday of the Venetian Empire, when the glassblowing reached its height, if you were a glassblower in Venice and you tried to leave the island, you were beheaded. If you got to England, you were knighted. The only craftsman in England that could be knighted was a glassblower.
What's happened in America is that places like Pilchuck have brought, before it was too late, the great masters of Europe in all of the techniques and exposed American kids to them who wanted nothing better than to be the sorcerer's apprentice. And some of them are very definitely have become the sorcerers.
These young guys like Marvin Lipowski and Dale Chihuly came and just took from us in a way and made it their own technique because they added so much of themselves.
Most of the techniques we see here today are European techniques, have been developed to an extent that is extraordinary.
The remarkable growth of glass art in the United States has happened because artists from all over the world have generously shared their techniques in art schools and universities with glass programs, but especially here at the Pilchuck Glass School in Washington State. Blowing, shaping, cutting, painting. 5 artists have mastered the techniques needed to work glass and are now realizing their individual dreams in this exacting medium. Glass is one of the world's most ordinary yet useful materials. We cover entire buildings with it. We transport ourselves in envelopes of glass. Every day we use glass in a dozen different ways. And for the last 4,000 years, this utilitarian substance has been used to create beautiful objects. Magnificent stained glass windows in European cathedrals, the sparkling elegance of Waterford crystal, and the extravagant creations by Venetian glass masters. Yet in the United States, glass blowing by artists in their studios has only been possible since the 1960s, when smaller furnaces were developed. And in fewer than 25 years, American artists working in glass have developed their own unique styles. 5 artists, William Morris, Judith Schachter, Thurman Statham, Ginny Ruffner, and Richard Marcus demonstrate the variety of glass art made in America today. Their artistic visions and innovative uses of old and new techniques have put them in the forefront of American glass artistry. Bill Morris is a hunter. His relationship with the animals he pursues has led him to the creation of a series of animal and hunting-inspired pieces. Born of fire, his creations reflect the workings of primitive hunting magic and modern technical sophistication. Bill Morris is in the hot shop at the Pilchuck Glass School. He will quickly transform this gather of hot glass into a prehistoric-looking tooth. Forming glass with his innovative techniques, he can make complex shapes with richly textured and colored surfaces.
Once you have the amount of glass you want, then your final exterior color is added. That color, again, is applied by crushed glass flour that's sprinkled on in 3 varying shades.
The glass is reheated constantly. If it cools too quickly, it will crack or shatter. Knowing this, Bill plunges his creation into a bucket of water.
Then the piece is quenched in water, which chills the outside and makes it stiff. And then high-pressure air is injected into the blowpipe, which causes the inside to expand and that outside skin to crack and break open, causing these open fissures. Those cracks are then filled with glass powder by being ground into a bowl full of powder, and then the surface is wiped with a rag, leaving only the powder in the cracks. Once that's reheated, then that glass fuses with the surface, is melted back smooth, so all that remains is a visual record of the crack, and it's no longer a structural compromise in the surface at all.
In his studio not far from Pilchuck, Bill reveals one of his canopic jars. Detailed, difficult pieces based on ancient Egyptian burial vessels.
In so developing the animals and the ideas behind them, depicting them on the jars in some kind of a metamorphic state lent itself to me as another way to kind of project characteristics of the animal. Rather than the literal interpretation of the head, I also had the surface of the jar to work with perhaps a storyline in the original hunting methods that people would use, which would be actually to wear a cape of the animal they were hunting as a sense of disguise.
Primitive hunters wearing animal skins cover the jar. They are not painted.
It's crushed glass sand, similar to the powder that we put on the surface. The images are sketched into the powder, and then all the surrounding material is vacuumed up, leaving the image in glass sand that is rolled up on the surface of a hot cylinder of glass.
The staring, eerily lifelike deer head was formed with glass that was still molten over 1,000 degrees Celsius.
The process in making a head takes anywhere from 6 to 7 hours, and the tools that we use are very subtle tweezers, knife blades, curved pieces of metal to push, pull, and to prod and coax the glass into its final shape. So these objects are not necessarily replications of found anthropological objects, or as they might be things that I might have changed or altered to suggest something, but not a definitive story, something that the viewer might interpret on their own.
In the discipline of the hunt, in pursuit of prey, Bill Morris has traveled the outback of his imagination and returned with primal insights.
In my own background with hunting and some of the ideas of ritual with the other artifacts, I realized that I was finding out my own story with the animals about their own viscera and what was to be done with it once the animal was killed. There's elements within ourselves that when we are hunting and in tune with a particular animal, that we manifest some of the characteristics of that animal.
I wanted to paint. One of the things I never liked about painting was that they painted always on flat surfaces. My interest in painting was being able to paint in the air.
Thurman Statham uses glass shards, paint, cards, glue, and found objects to furnish his glass houses. He makes large-scale pieces as well as smaller, more intimate ones, but returns to certain shapes he finds endlessly challenging.
The forms being the house, the ladder, the chair, and the table. I limited myself to those forms because I was interested more in what I did to those forms rather than changing the three-dimensionality of it. The house structure, one of the things that intrigued me about it was how they could be so different. I intuitively felt good about the houses, and usually about the forms, it's almost like a canvas that sets it can be another world.
This piece evolved as a narrative about an imagined ritual in the Far East.
I was particularly interested in an unknown part or a little known part of Cambodia. And I was real interested in a sense of timelessness in this particular piece. And of also, to be real specific, of some form of spiritual flight. The writing on this piece refers to a ceremony that never existed, that I created in my own head, that I would have liked to have been at, and it rained during that time. In the first flight, it started to rain. The raining during this event, which I can't particularly describe, sort of was a confirmation of this person's spiritual rebirth.
The concept of the glass house is carefully planned, but the details are more often intuitive.
Somewhere in the line there's a sketch of this house, and it, believe it or not, it probably has shards, applications drawn on it, and a basic atmosphere. Some of them are recordings of a time when they were done, of past experiences that I've had, of places I'd like to be. I'll have a very clear idea of how a painting would look before I make it. It just pops in my head.
The discard bins at the Pilchuck Glass School are a treasure trove.
It's remarkable that I can look into a pile of stuff like this and find things that I need. And I think after a certain amount of time I have a rapport, but even the use of shards and objects is getting more clear. The Confederate general inside of it, as opposed to the Buddha, is more of a, in one side of it's a personal reference to my own history and the whole issue of my own cultural heritage, and as an African American artist in the States. I guess in one way the cards function like a painting gesture, color, except that it's got paper, it's got imagery in it, it's got graphics, it's got, you know, and that sort of adds to the gesture. And that's one of the reasons I like using the cards. They once they're used in the paintings, they become something more than just a playing card. They become an image, and they function within the painting, and they have a lot to do with the success of the painting. I just throw these sort of symbols and hints in. If I wanted this piece to have a lot of sense of mysticism to it also. I love glass, period. I just, like, love it.
All art is a sort of metaphor of a figure ground problem, which is some sort of metaphor for like how a human being, exists in life metaphor. So that to me is sort of the function of art.
Judith Schachter doesn't shrink from the less pleasant side of life. She relishes it and embellishes it. She makes it so beautiful we cannot look away.
I'm very, very interested in my subject matter, but actually it's an excuse to involve me in a dialogue with the medium of glass.
Judith's pieces are made from colored flash glass. She shapes and cuts, then sandblasts and paints the glass. The pieces are then layered and held together with lead or copper channeling. The results have been described as gruesomely beautiful.
I don't draw the figure from life. I draw it strictly from my imagination. I guess I've been sort of morbid ever since I was a kid. It's hard to talk about something that's like been part of you all your life. I don't think I have any extraordinary interest in macabre subject matter. I think pretty much everyone can relate to my subject matter.
Judith's sketchbook, tentative beginnings, lists, vague outlines of ideas, a look into the mind of the artist.
If you go through the sketchbook, it's almost all faces. And some of them interest me and some of them don't. The one thing about faces that most interests me is faces that express a range of contradictory emotions. People look at my work and frequently think, oh, it's so despairing. But I don't think I've ever done a face that was despairing without an element of hope, because I'm not interested in despair. Everyone knows how to despair.
Some pieces begin in characteristic fashion. Judith will doodle and sketch while watching television. She achieves an almost unconscious flow of image onto paper.
So when I'm sketching and watching television, it's easy for me to forget what I'm doing and to take a face up to a level where it's acceptable, and then to push it even further and take a risk in ruining it, basically, and then get to some level where it really intrigues me. This one is more typical, where I just start out with an idea for a face that turns into an idea for a body, that turns into an idea for the glass, which turns into an idea for the background. This is the sketch from Bad Night with Insomnia. This just, I don't know, it just came out of my hand. In my mind, it's a portrait of a person that happened to inspire me. The whole insomnia thing just came totally later. I wasn't thinking I have to draw a face for that insomnia piece. Originally, the composition was more like that, which is very static. And then I decided to make this area with nothing in it, because 1995 was the year I decided to become a minimalist. And instead of divide the picture plane that way, I just thought it would be much more interesting to do it this way and to integrate the two planes of the figure, which is sort of an S shape, and have this like mass up here compressing him, compressing his head into this area. See, I really think a lot about composition, no kidding.
Turning an idea into glass then presents a series of difficult technical challenges.
The slightest change to a face that's pretty subtle will change it completely. And I've struggled and struggled and struggled to keep the nuances in the faces. And see, I've got like a million versions of this face that I've rejected. This glass wouldn't cooperate. I just don't want to ever say one side of the story. I want to be as vague as possible so that everyone can read a million things into it.
In the sketchbook is a stylized self-portrait.
She's not happy. I would say it's more ecstatic, which is more happy and joy are not the same as ecstasy, which is kind of manic and compulsive. I wouldn't call her happy. She's like a little spirit that like walks along the highway until she finds a car wreck and then does a little dance, and then goes and looks for another car wreck.
In 1991, Ginny Ruffner was injured in a car accident. Damage to her brain compromised the capability of the left side of her body and her left hand, the one she drew with. After the wreck, she was unable to walk or speak clearly.
No, I did a lot of painting before the wreck, and it's a little more difficult now.
I did a lot of painting before the wreck, and it's a little more difficult now. I don't do it as much, but I still do it, and I still love to paint, but just not as much as I did before. It's a joyous thing for me to do, and I love the feeling, the smell, everything about painting.
Ginny got back on her feet, literally, through strenuous physical therapy and a ferociously positive attitude. She has regained much of her previous independence. Her physical recovery has been matched by the reawakening of her abilities in the design of complex glass sculpture.
The vases represent the outer beauty. The grapes represent the inner beauty. I'm interested in the idea of containment. The object implicates what's inside and outside, and the object is a thing of beauty.
Using adversity as the subject of her art, Ginny translated her extraordinary experience into glass. With help from fellow artist James Minson, she created a number of painted glass sculptures called the Balance series. This intricate piece features a favorite subject, her cat, Studley.
But this piece is interesting. I like the way this piece has representations of
your older work as well as the Studley figure in the middle, which is the new series.
Balancing.
Yeah.
Because the whole balance series.
The whole balance series is about the various kinds of balance, like learning how to walk. So there's a balance of all the new and the old and everything, the balance of life and art. And you see the light bulb on his chest? It's the universal symbol of the idea. So balance is the idea, and the other concepts of balance, containment, and beauty, rather ephemeral ideas.
One of Ginny's Martians. The figure is her way of calling attention to beings that are different from the norm, aliens on their own planet.
The title is Learning to Cope with the Fountain of Youth. My idea is about surfing over the problems of age. I use the cats and Martians and foxes to indicate how alien I feel in a wheelchair, how strange it makes you feel, like another species.
You were telling me when you came out of the coma, one of the times was when the riots were going on in LA, and you thought that you'd woken up and you're on another planet or another time period or something. Yeah.
It was so bizarre.
Yeah, it must have been.
Yeah, that was so bizarre. That's why I used the Martian head, and it's really interesting that you can make this humanoid thing with the arms and legs and head, and all you have to do is paint it green, and everybody knows it's a Martian.
This is called collaboration.
And it's how it feels to collaborate. You have to have an amount of love, and you're literally tied together. And it's really a real balancing act. They both have their arms balancing, and the struggle is to stay on top of the paintbrush because it's obvious they have to stay together. And you notice they're tied to each other and not the brush. That shows where the connection is.
Using a gas torch, James heats and fuses together glass rods, a technique adopted and refined by Ginny. It is delicate, precise work. Her visions may be shaped by other hands now, but Ginny is still in charge.
Are all the brainwaves going to go into the frame? That's the only thing it's holding. So, okay. But these are female Martian angels with biceps. Okay. That's easy. I'll just let gravity take over. If we all stood on our heads all the time, we'd probably have perky butts too. This is the aerobics instructor coming out in you again.
I like that.
Yeah.
Aerobic Martians.
Aerobic Martians. I have to have an extra sensory perception of how this is going to look when it's sandblasted, because at the moment you can see that it's transparent and the surface has a very different look when it's clear. They're sandblasted so the pigment, the paint and the pencils and the dye will have something to stick to.
Another Martian, the beginning of a series on how the brain works. Glass thought waves project images on a sandblasted screen. She will fill the screen with figures and objects from history, mythology, and her own experience. Ginny Ruffner sees life from a point of view that few know. She uses her intellect and talent as an artist to help us understand something terribly difficult, a disability that affects both mind and body.
I'm sort of trained in Italian techniques, but I don't stick to them. If there's a better way for me to make something, I'll do it. So I'm not a purist at all.
Dick Marcus lives on an island in Washington State. The remote, saturated green surroundings of America's Pacific Northwest offer a quiet counterpoint to the roaring furnaces of his hot shop. Dick is an inveterate collector. His shop and home are filled with delightful oddities. The diversity of the collection is a reflection of the interests and unusual talents of this artist.
I made so many different things over the years. I mean, after 30 years, I can put a one-person show together that looks like a group show. I mean, see, there was a quote about me that I suffer from versatility.
In the late 60s, glassblowing in the States was in its infancy. Artists were just learning the most basic glass-forming techniques. It was then Dick discovered the rich history of Italian glassmaking.
I took a history of glass class and got interested in the old stuff. And this is at UC Berkeley. And there was stuff that I didn't know how it was made. Nobody knew. I mean, it was just sort of like, there's the whole myth of all the secrecy and things like that, but essentially it was like no one had the skills. And so it was just obvious to go to Italy.
Dick spent over a year working in a Venetian glass factory. On returning to the States, he adapted and refined what he had learned.
Making the Latticino or the Zanfirico, those guys could just, when they're pulling out, they just sort of like little blur, their hands are little blurs, and they get really tight twists on the cane. And I just never developed that skill. Plus, I never had the guy on the other end doing the same thing. And so I made a machine and rollers, so not only would it save my wrists, but I could get really tight patterns. So, I mean, some of the canes I make are just the really nice, fine, tight canes, but they're not made the traditional way. I make all the canes. Unfortunately, I haven't found a better place to get them. And these, it's sort of like the Marini. They're made really big, and with a bunch of stripes in them. And then as they're stretched out, they're twisted, and you get these pretty intricate twisted patterns on the inside. And then when it's blown out, the twists become lines like that. The thing that's most important to me in glass blowing is the form and how, the silhouette of it, the drawing of it. And then, if that's good, then it can have all these complicated patterns.
Another technique is Marini, glass rods with shapes, letters, even words embedded in them. The rods are heated and pulled like taffy, resulting in ever smaller images.
And like here's an example of a start of a Marini before it's pulled. These things get assembled, and then I wrap wire around them, and I pick them up and stretch them out, and I end up, with something like this. And then these just get chopped up. They just get chopped up with nippers, and I lay them out in patterns.
This vase is made entirely of the small Marini chips.
First, I make a ceramic mold to the shape I want. Then I put all those things together and fuse it really hot in the glory hole. It's just a sheet. It's nice and smooth. Then I pick it up and put it over the mold, and then there's a whole bunch of sort of yelling and smoke and fire and sticks and going in and out of the furnace, and we get it down to the shape we want, or the shape I want.
Utilizing the Marini technique and weeks of trial and error, Dick executed a complete version of the Lord's Prayer. It is only about 2.5 centimeters in diameter. His favorite subject? A common kitchen item. Mr. Marcus is famous for his colorful, eccentric, impractical teapots.
They have the spout and the handle and the lid, and you get to mess around with it more. It's just more things to be able to fool around with in terms of a shape. So that's why I got interested in it, and it got to be sort of a signature piece. For a while, I was having nightmares about those patterns. You know, just before I go to bed, these patterns would come in. I couldn't handle them anymore. But I always seem to go back to it because it still has this interest for me. It's like, they're fun to make.
On his green island, Dick Marcus continues to turn glass into the humorous, the beautiful, and the unexpected. Glass has certainly come of age in American art. Museums and galleries collect and exhibit glass art alongside painting and sculpture. Art magazines publish critical reviews of glass art exhibitions, and collectors have formed organizations to share their passion for collecting glass with others. Looking at the creative work of these artists in this difficult medium, we can declare that they are truly masters of their art.